Hello, my name's Tim Beasley-Murray. I'm Associate Professor of European Thought and Culture, and I'm also the person who, along with Catherine and Jess and the whole team, is behind this Inspiring Minds welcome season. So welcome to today's event, and welcome to this week of the Inspiring Minds welcome season of events. After 3 absolutely fantastic weeks, we've had the Matter of Black Lives, run by Zine. We've had Gender and Sexuality Somewhere Over the Rainbow, run by Natasha Tanner. And last week we had Climate Emergency, run by Emily Baker, whose birthday is today. Happy birthday, Emily. After 3 fantastic weeks, we're now turning to consider really this new reality that we're experiencing and we're living through the pandemic and through various forms of confinement and lockdown. And we're looking at it under the heading of local, global, and virtual worlds. What does it mean that when, let's say, we look at this poll where we all are, we're in different places, we're very much confined in our local situation, but through these digital lives that we're living much more fully now, we're connected globally and virtually in various sorts of rather strange ways. And this week wants to look at that, and it wants to look at the role of culture in it. So today we're going to talk about this text by Borges that I'll introduce in a moment. Tomorrow we're going to look with Hélène Neveu-Kringelbach at Dancing at Dusk, which is a performance by a set of dancers from throughout Africa, but performed in Senegal on a beach, of a piece of choreography by a German choreographer based on a Russian ballet. So we're going to be questioning what happens when culture travels, right, globally to different contexts, is appropriated and reimagined and reperformed, and then experienced, watched by viewers throughout the world via actually a theatre in London, Sadler's Wells. So that's tomorrow's event. It should be really special. Come and join us for that. And then on Friday, I think we're going to have with Antonis Bikakis, who has been coordinating this week. I should have mentioned that earlier. With Antonis, we'll be chairing a discussion of museums in a virtual world. How do we explore, how do we experience culture virtually in museums, and what difference does that make to the processes of both display, curation, but also consumption of culture? But today, we're going to talk about the text I hope all of you have read, namely this, and I'm going to share my screen here, namely a very short story by, let me go back to the beginning, by Jorge Luis Borges, The Library of Babel. Okay, I think I'm pretty right in thinking, I have my copy here, that Borges never wrote a piece of fiction that was longer than 14 pages. You will have seen that this text is shorter than that. It's about 7 pages, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the Library of Babel, here we have on the right-hand side, we have a copy of one English edition of it, which gives a little visual representation. And below we have Borges himself. I am, by the way, not at all a Spanish or Latin American specialist. We have a number of them in the house, Natasha and Emily and perhaps others. So what I say comes from a position simply of fascination rather than great knowledge. But this was a short story that first appeared in an absolutely groundbreaking collection, The Garden of Forking Paths, and it was written in 1940. And it's a text that I think you'll see is full of epiphanies, sudden realizations of various sorts. We see a number of them throughout the text, but itself we might attribute it to a sort of slow epiphany in Borges's life. And weirdly, the content of the story reproduces the context in which Borges wrote it. So normally at university, we don't talk very much about biography and the way in which biography shapes stories. But here I think they're interesting and deliberately constructed parallels. And I just want to read you this little account of that really is taken from Borges's own autobiographical essay. So when he writes this book, he's approaching the age of 40, and for the first time in his life, in 1937, he actually gets a full-time job. And he gets a job at the branch of the municipal library in Buenos Aires in Argentina. Now, this apparently is quite a working class district where the library was. So as a result, it doesn't actually have very many books. And I'll just read you this text because I find it quite funny and quite illuminating. Borges was assigned to work on a catalogue of the books, which no one seemed to need and was never to be completed. So already we have this notion, right, of a library that paradoxically, because it's, even though it's very small, is actually infinite. It's never going to be completed. Anyway, on his first day, Borges indexed some 400 books and was chastised by his co-workers. Their jobs depended on the incompletion of the catalogue, so they did as little work as possible. So here we have some real life figures who are a little bit like the librarians in the story, but who deliberately want to make this their jobs to last forever, and hence the job of cataloguing the books to last forever. Something Borges's diligence would expose. They instructed him to never index more than 100 books, but to vary the amount from day to day to avoid suspicion. He spent the 9 years he worked there doing an hour of cataloguing in the mornings, then passing the rest of the day hidden in the stacks, reading and writing. So I think also here we have quite an amusing image of someone who's living in the library, but sort of occupying himself with all these other tasks that perhaps aren't actually what librarians might do. We might want to ask in the story, incidentally, what is it the librarians do? Anyway, I'll carry on. One day he grazed his head on an open window casement and developed septicemia. He was expected to die, and when that did not come to pass, his doctors predicted he would never regain his mental faculties. So I think here we also have an interesting thing we find reflected in the text, or somehow articulated other ways. Library is a place to die. We might not normally think of a library as a place to die. And this sense of oscillation between cultural production and madness or illness. Anyway, Borges was nervous to return to the writing of criticism or poetry, since he had a reputation in these fields, and was just as worried to learn himself if he had lost his gift. It was sitting in this library, and apparently it was often in the basement, by the way, that he hid out, pretending to work, or in warm weather on the roof. And I quite like the way in which, right, here he is writing these stories in these liminal positions, either in the basement or on the roof, fearing for his capacities, that he wrote the stories of, well, I won't read it in Spanish, The Garden of Forking Paths, including the Library of Babel. Okay, so much for the genesis of the Library of the Babel, but why have I chosen it? Why are we looking at it? Well, the easy answer, and this is perhaps the most obvious answer, is because Borges he's one of these writers. There are a number of other ones. One can think of Michel Houellebecq in political terms. But anyway, one of these writers who appears to sort of forecast in their fiction things that have yet to come into being. And in this story in particular, and in other stories, the Total Library is another one, the Book of Sand is another, but he appears to imagine this virtual world of the internet, this universe which is the library, as he puts it right away in the first line. But I think interestingly, the internet is less obviously foreshadowed in the description of the Library of Babel than it is in the footnote. Okay, now this is the footnote, the last footnote that we get right at the end, and perhaps in discussions we can talk about this footnote more. I'm going to read it to you now. Letizia Alvarez de Toledo, who actually was a real person, so oddly she's not made up, but she's also interestingly the only woman in the text. Anyway, she has observed that this vast library is useless. Rigorously speaking, a single volume would be sufficient. A volume of ordinary format, printed in 9 or 10 point type, containing an infinite number of infinitely thin leaves, etc. The handling of this silky vada mecum would not be convenient. Each apparent page would unfold into other analogous ones. The inconceivable middle page would have no reverse. End of quotation. That's actually the final words of the story. So already here we see a sort of Borges paradox. Totality is either something infinitely large, this library that seems to spread on with its proliferation of hexagonal cells, or something infinitely small, the infinitely thin pages that make up the single book that is in this footnote. But here we really have quite a more realistic or more effective parallel to the internet, that in a tiny space, our laptop or whatever it might be, or even our phone, we contain this perhaps endless amount of knowledge, much of which is gibberish, right? That is, right, the entirety of digital knowledge. Before I move on, I just want to comment on the fact that this is in a footnote. Right? One should always, as a reader, pay attention to footnotes and paratext, so the bits around the text, and perhaps above all in a text written by a librarian. Librarians really care about that stuff. But I think there's something quite interesting and self-reflexive being made here. The truth about the infinite is in a book that is only contained in a footnote, i.e. something that is infinitesimally small. Here we have a sort of set of Russian dolls that seem to get smaller and smaller. And at the smallest element of the text, that's where the totality of the thing that the text is talking about is to be found. Okay, here are a couple of references. There's a nice New York Times article that makes a few points about how Borges seems to foresee various parts of digital knowledge. And here's actually the book, Borges 2.0, that really, quite polemically, and it's actually been disputed in the literature, but really argues that Borges sort of, makes these parallels, explores these parallels between Borges' writing in general and our digital world. Okay, that was one reason. But I think the other reason why I'd like to talk about, or I think we could talk about the Library of Bible today, is the experience of confinement. Borges describes a situation in this text where paradoxically the experience of confinement and the experience of limitlessness combine. So the librarians, right? They are locked in their hexagonal cells, of which they're the garden with their 410, or is it 420 books? I forget. So they are confined. They literally inhabit cells, but they're also aware that these cells are simply one of an apparent limitless beehive of identical cells in which are contained an apparently limitless series of all possible books. Okay, so confinement and limitlessness come together. And I think this might echo our experience of lockdown. We are, as it were, all in our own cells. Look around the room where you are now. We're facing our own hexagonal walls. But nonetheless, that experience of being locked down makes us aware of the limitlessness. It actually makes us rethink about time. That's another point. But through the internet, through our digital lives, we reach out into limitlessness. Now, the question for us today, as well as a question for Borges' narrator, is this situation, is this commingling of confinement and limitlessness, is this a reason for melancholy or despair, melancholy and despair on the one hand, or hope on the other? Because obviously confinement can on the one hand be a reason for hope we got finally in our grasp, but it can also be a reason for despair. A limitless can likewise be a reason for hope, a sense of possibility, but it also can be a feeling of reason for despair, a sense that deferral, right? We continue looking for something and it's always out our reach. And my question might be also, I guess, how does this relate to the themes of hope that have been strong in inspiring minds so far? But that's maybe for a sort of meta discussion another time. Okay, so this is why I thought we might want to think about the Library of Babel today. One, this sense that it says something about our digital age, and secondly, specifically, our experience of confinement and limitlessness and the concomitant sort of pairing of melancholy and hope. So some things to think about and discuss in our groups. What we're going to do today is we're going to break into groups chaired by Jennifer and by Natasha and by me, and we're going to talk about various things. So I won't go on too long now, but just some suggestions of the sort of things that we might talk about. First of all, what's with the title? Okay, the title is The Library of Babel, and clearly that's a reference. This is a text about books that refer to other books and continually refer to yet more books. So it's a text that is about intertextuality. And with the title, we have a form of intertext. We have a pointer to the story of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis. And I just thought we might as well read this now just to remind ourselves of this story. And here it goes. And the whole earth was of one language and one speech. So we're way back in Genesis. We're right at this mythical beginning of humanity when everybody speaks one language. And they said, human beings, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Okay, so the idea is they're building this tower that reaches right up into the heavens, okay, that will give them a name as people who speak one language, the people of all the earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Okay, so this is God jealously saying, why is my creation reaching up towards heaven? Go to, let us go down and there confound their language, right? Separate their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. They stopped building the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Okay, so that's the story of the Tower of Babel, with which this story of the Library of Babel is in dialogue. So we might want to compare Tower versus Library of Babel. And here we can see visually, instantly, here we have the famous Bruegel picture of the Tower of Babel at the bottom. And here we have a visualization of what the Library of Babel might look like. And we can see the similar cellular shape. But we might ask about the significance of the various religious sects and their messianic quests in the library. We might ask how these different quests, or indeed the notion of the library itself, the library that contains all possible books, relate to the ideas of blasphemy and hubris in the Tower of Babel story. And I'm suggesting that the Tower of Babel story contains a sort of Jewish version of hubris. And we might also ask about the significance of language and languages in the story. And perhaps most strangely, the narrator's question at one point, you who read me, are you sure of understanding my language? Okay, language seems to me to be a very important theme here. And the second thing I want to mention before we went over into our discussion groups was this. I've already talked about one sort of paratext, namely the footnote, or one of the footnotes. Now I just wanted to talk about the other sort of paratext, the epigram. Epigrams are things that come right at the beginning of a text, a quotation for something else, and very often we don't read them properly, but very often they have something really crucial. And here the epigram reads as follows. By this art you may contemplate the variations of the 23 letters. Well, what is this? This is a quotation from an incredible book by the English writer Robert Burton, published in 1621. This book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, is sprawling and capacious and vast and full of massive digressions and quotations from other writers, some of them who are made up. It is, in a sense, a book that is like the library that Borges' story is about. Right? So this is quite interesting. Once again, in the tiniest element, this tiny little epigram, almost the whole book, Borges' book, is in a way contained. Now, in this preface, Burton, writing under a pseudonym, says, I write of melancholy by being busy to avoid melancholy. So this book that apparently is about melancholy is a means for Burton's narrator to exercise melancholy, to get rid of melancholy by writing about it. Right? In the Library of Babel, the narrator makes much the same point. He says, methodical composition distracts me from the present condition of humanity. So we have perhaps another paradox. Writing is a cure for melancholy on the one hand, but also its cause, because the quotation continues from the Library of Babel. The certitude that everything has been written negates us or turns us into phantoms. That's to say, because everything is already contained in the library, the process of writing, which is meant to be a cure for despair, is itself depressing, because what one writes has by definition already been written. Well, just quickly for people who are interested in this, there's something also rather curious in this epigram. Burton speaks of 23 letters, because that's what the alphabet contained in his time. The text we have speaks of 25 syllables, including punctuation, but the text we actually hold in our hands is written in many more. It has all 26 letters of the alphabet plus various forms of punctuation. We might think, what does it mean that the text that we're reading doesn't correspond to the sort of text that the narrator is talking about in the library? Just something you might want to think about. But finally, I think this is a question that we could talk about. Is this a text of hope or despair? Perhaps you might want to look at this really crucial passage about the vindications. I guess I will read them just briefly, this passage. We have a little bit of time. At that time, a great deal was said about the vindications, books of apology and prophecy, which vindicated for all time the acts of every man in the universe and retained prodigious arcana for his future. Okay, so here the idea is that in the library, there's a book written for every one of us, that somewhere out there, there's a book that's written about me and about you that justifies and explains our existence, right? An extraordinary idea. But if the library contains all possible books, then that book, which is surely possible, must be somewhere there. So thousands of the greedy abandoned their sweet native hexagons and rushed up the stairways, urged on by the vain intention of finding their vindication. These pilgrims disputed in the narrow corridors, proffered dark curses, strangled each other on the divine stairways, flung the deceptive books into the air shafts, met their death cast down in a similar fashion by the inhabitants of remote regions. Others went mad. And here the narrator comments, the vindications exist. And here's a crucial parenthesis. I have seen two which refer to persons of the future, to persons who are perhaps not imaginary. So the only one that the narrator has found don't refer to anyone who's actually existed, but people who themselves are possible existences. Anyway, I'll carry on with the quotation. But the searchers did not remember that the possibility of a man's finding his vindication or some treacherous variation thereof can be computed as zero. Okay, so this passage takes us through an arc of hope, the idea that there are books out there that justify our existence, through to some realization that that hope is illusory, right? And sort of hope is an interesting point, full stop, you know, that Pandora's box has been opened, but the last thing left there is hope. Well, is that a curse or is it a blessing? Because hope is something that means that we have illusionary ideas about reality that is in fact crushing. That's the notion of the Greek point. But anyway, but how do we think about this text? Is it a text of hope or despair? Just to give the final sentences, I'll quote them before we go into our discussions. If an eternal traveler were to cross it in any direction, after centuries, he would see that the same volumes were repeated in the same disorder, which, thus repeated, would be an order, the order. Okay, so right at the end, there's this final epiphany where the narrator realizes that the disorder of the library might, through repetition, become some sort of order. As a result, he concludes, my solitude is gladdened by this elegant hope. Okay, well, lots for us to discuss. I'm going to stop sharing. Let me come back. And now I think it's 16:32, my computer's clock tells me. We'll go into discussions for about 20 minutes, something like that. And then maybe we'll have another 20 minutes where we'll come back to plenary. And I like, you know, each group to tell everybody about what they've been discussing. But Jess, do you think you could press the button which divides us into groups, and we'll do the sorting hat, and we'll see which house we end up, Slytherin or Gryffindor, but we'll be able to discuss more in our groups. We had a fantastic discussion in our group with Emily, Safi and Jonathan on a whole really wide-ranging set of things. My internet was going, so if it does go again, Jennifer has promised to take over for me. Antonis, I see that you're here as well. I really should have made more of the fact that Antonis Pikakis has put together this week as well. So it's good to see that you are in one of the groups. But why don't we start with whichever group? Let's start with the one, Antonis, that you were in. And why don't we start with whoever from that group has agreed to report back and say what your discussions were about.
Hi, Tim. I didn't really assign anybody, not that I particularly want this role, especially because Versto, the dog, is very keen on barking. So your internet is going and he's always interrupting me by barking. But I had Antonis in my group, which was great. Because having someone who really thinks about information studies in a technical way for this text is such a gift, and I hope we'll have time to hear more from him about that. And obviously at the round table at the end of the week when we can pull these threads together. So there was me and Antonis and then 2 MA students, one from the Slade and one from gender studies, who were all sort of, I think, knew this text before, but we're coming for it having thought about that sort of thing in their BA dissertations, or sort of it's maybe not necessarily a totally new text to them, but it is a new context in which to read it, as you were saying about lockdown and everything. And one of the students actually read it in Chinese, she was saying, which I think, and as I said, we're reading it in English, but we could also, that's not the original language either, and that affects, again, the symbols, the letters, the numbers of letters in the alphabet, and it connects very much to that story then of Babel, that in a way this text itself proves that point, that it's just proliferating in lots of different languages. And Borges wrote a lot about translation, actually, and he says that he doesn't believe in the concept of an original, actually. He says there are only drafts, right? He says that in his essay, The Homeric Versions, right? So there are only drafts or versions, so it's fine that we're reading it in English or Chinese or whatever, but it's obviously different in some respects. I suppose I started by asking people about what struck them about this text, and then we moved on more to your topic about the question of religion, I guess, and also the question of lockdown. We talked for quite a while about how is it that he manages to prophesize the internet. I still think we haven't really answered that question, which maybe goes to the question of, does he believe in a god, or is there a god in this structure, right? Like, how is it that there's prophecy here? But then we also talked about the limits of the analogy with the internet, right? So one of the things being there's no search engine. So it's quite, you've got the information, but you can't search for it. It's actually a very non-digital text, isn't it, really, that you've got to look for every physical copy and everything. So we talked about that, but Antonis also said that he said that it's not just the internet, it's future technologies that we haven't yet got, so it's sort of not exhausted by the analogy with the internet either, which was a great point. And he was saying that in MIT there's a lab that's trying to work out a kind of, using an AI, some sort of program, I'm probably butchering this explanation, but that would be able to translate any language or any text, right? That it was, that they're working on that type of structure. And so it's partly, the internet doesn't exhaust the possibility of this text, actually, which is exciting. And there are also limits to the analogy, and which I think is important, because you were saying this, that one of those articles, that there is a way in which this has often been approached as about the internet. So what do you do when there's no search engine? But we also talked a little bit about what do you do when so much of it is nonsense or unreadable or incomprehensible. And I think that's what struck me. It's a very that it's not even that one wants to read all of that, right? Because you can't work out the language, even when the examples that are given in the text. Which I guess got us onto the question of religious belief and whether there was order or disorder, or Ifan had this lovely phrase about the totality that exists in chaos, which I thought was a lovely way to think about the text. And then so we were talking about whether we, given that there is a design, does that mean there's a creator, etc., and is there a logic to it? So we talked quite a lot about that. And the last question we asked was about whether we identified with this text in any way. So with our own experiences, as you were suggesting with lockdown. And I think, we were hoping to find more kind of joy or pleasure in this sense of the infinite, but I'm afraid that our group, I think we're quite tired actually. But maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but we did feel a bit overwhelmed, I think, you know, that there was a way in which, and that we did see it as a kind of metaphor for lockdown, but we also saw it as a metaphor for research, which is where I think we felt overwhelmed, you know, that that you can never read everything, you can never even find everything, and then why are we adding more books to that? So I think we came back round to melancholy really, but I think maybe if you'd asked us first thing in the morning, we would have had a different view. So, but
That's
I hope my group thinks that was an adequate summary.
That's really fascinating what your group was talking about. I love, by the way, Yifan's comment in the chat here. The Library of Babel constituted of Chinese characters will be much bigger than the Library of Babel constituted 25 letters, question mark, different size of infinity. That's a wonderful reflection. Yes, I think that the notion actually of thinking about research, right, is, and I think maybe, I'm not sure how many first year students are in the house here. I think we tend to have MA students and first years, but that's also another analogy to look at. And I don't want us to end up with despair by any means, but really, really, really fascinating stuff. I see Antonis has posted a link in the chat.
Yeah, that's a link to this article that I was referring to in that discussion about this work from this MIT group that now uses AI technology to try to translate lost languages. And it's really fascinating. So, I mean, reading this book, I couldn't stop making analogies, not just to the internet, but to all this AI technology, to the non-explainable machine learning algorithms that we are now using to extract meaning from text or from images or from anything, and we still do not know how exactly this work. But anyway, I think I've said enough. But this is a good article, so
Thank you, Antonis. That's really interesting. I've just put in the text, right? There's this bit where they spend 100 years working out, what language a text is in, and the answer is something completely nonsensical, incidentally, whereas your AI would take rather less. Let's move on to, because I'm aware it's quite late, and maybe people are tired. We'll go on for about another quarter of an hour. We'll see. We're another quarter of an hour, let's say. Let's go on to the group that Natasha was in. Who's reporting back from the group Natasha was in?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, but and the others can come in if I forget something. But I had a really enjoyed the conversation with Cecily and Anna Maria, both PhD students. Cecily's just started, so we were talking about the research process as well by the end. But we started off talking a bit about the idea of fake news and fake news relating to COVID and how information circulates, and how the digital form, for example, things circulating through WhatsApp, what kind of legitimacy that adds to text. And we were sort of talking, or to information, and we were talking a bit about, that's not fake news isn't a new thing, but the scale and how viral things can go and the speed perhaps is. And so we were speaking a little bit about the democratization of knowledge and who might be considered a knowledge producer, and how obviously that has some good implications, but also the dangers of that, and how form gives something legitimacy. And we were talking about Borges's work and the use of footnotes and a scientific kind of register, and he often plays with the idea of sort of truth and fiction and blurring these things. So that led us to think a little bit about this kind of scholarly form, and what it is we're doing, writing in the particular forms that we write in, and in the languages that we write in, and how at UCL, London's global university, a lot of the sources on a lot of the courses, even say anthropology, that you would think might be more attentive to different ways of conceiving knowledge, is often in English. So we were sort of talking about where and in what languages knowledge gets produced, in the hierarchy of languages as well. We spoke a little bit about whether a sense of being made to feel sort of small with this expanding kind of infinite universe of knowledge, whether that's reassuring because you feel like what you do doesn't have any impact, or whether it's kind of somehow empowering as well. So we had a few conversations around that. We spoke a little bit about so really interestingly, Cecily work, and she might want to come in and say something more, works on ideas of innovation. And so we were talking about originality and what scholarly originality means, and difference between sort of inventio, so invenire, coming upon things that already exist, and then the more romantic original genius idea of creation. So yeah, we were just reflecting on originality as the rearrangement of what is already known versus and the demands on PhD students, for example, to complete an original piece of research, and just sort of questioning what that means within the university sphere as well. But it was excellent being in conversation with both of them. Do you want to come in, either of you? I probably missed something.
Oh, I think it was perfect. Thank you. You made a very good summary. I couldn't have in any way summarized. We went into so many directions, but I think one thing that I thought was interesting that I wrote down is that when we talked about fake news, that it is that we were thinking about what makes it new, or if there's a new aspect to fake news, and we're thinking about if it's connected maybe to like the source, or being to trace back to a source. I thought that was something that just stuck to my mind. And then the last, I think, connected to also my topic and me beginning a PhD, I have kind of decided, from trying to understand how the research process works, and if I'm going to just like put a book on top of a pile of books that I all have to know, or how does it, how do I relate to all this knowledge? I have decided for me to follow more, maybe this little romantic view that he has in the text in the beginning, where you have like a more limited local space where I am going to stay, because I'm only going to be able to stay there, and I'm going to hope that somehow, I have an impact over that, that has an impact maybe somewhere, but I'm not going to have the idea of having an impact on the whole thing and wanting to control that. Yeah, I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we spoke a little about if the hexagons are sort of our little disciplines, and yeah, that where we're hoping to have an impact, and what impact mean, that word that's become so charged in the times of ref and research in the university. Anna Maria, was there anything that we didn't mention that you wanted to come in with?
You're muted.
No, that's all. I think that's all. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Tim. I guess it's you're up next.
It's our group next. Well, I'm not going to talk. I'm going to see, I think Jonathan and Safi and Emily were in our group, but Jonathan and Safi, one of you will go, I think. So over to you.
Well, yeah, so leading on from what Natasha and Cecily were saying, we discussed quite a lot about fake news, and sort of teased out that idea that Cecily mentioned about sort of finding the source, and in a library where there are infinite resources, how anything that is fake or nonsense can be deciphered and can be proven to be, or can be made into sense. And likewise, well, on the flip side of that, how anything that seems sensical can be destabilized and become nonsense, and how Borges, in doing this, deconstructs the opposition between the two, and even, we went on to say, seems to deconstruct meaning itself. And that led us on to more of some of the religious aspects of the text, and about the search for meaning and the search for religious meaning. And we discussed a bit about apophatic theology, the negative way, and how the futility of the search for meaning.
Yeah, and sort of adding on to what Jonathan's mentioned about our discussion of apophatic theology, yeah, there's definitely this sense that the individuals in the short story are engaged in this kind of forbidden quest for an ultimate final knowledge, a final meaning. And it seems like this ultimate meaning, this God of the library, just like the God in the book of Genesis is one who's designed, is one who aims to confine and confound its creations. So the individuals in the library are on this sort of constant futile search for meaning, constantly confined, physically, well, constantly confined, while also attempting to reach a sort of transcendence. And I guess linking that to the internet, one could say, I mean, it's obviously, like Jonathan mentioned, the internet's full of a lot of nonsense. It's full of a lot of people's opinions. So there's this sense of an ultimate truth, even just if one hears about a certain political event or a world event, one often has to dig through all the opinions and all the sort of propaganda and biases to actually try and get to the basic facts of what's going on. I'm not sure if we talked about whether this whole circumstance leads to sort of melancholy or joy. It certainly seems quite complex, but this sense of the infinite, I think Borges mentions in the short story, humanity's infinite capacity for hope. So there is something there with that.
Great, thanks, Jonathan and Safi. Emily, did you want to add to what we've just been saying, some birthday reflections?
Well, yeah, I don't think I have anything to add. I think it worked really well to summarize the discussion. I suppose I was, as a sort of Latin Americanist, making associations between different of Borges's stories and this preoccupation for order and the sort of violence that can come from humans trying to impose order on the universe or trying to understand it and make sense of it is one of the key themes of this story and others. And yeah, that was it. We're sort of having this chat now about whether or not that leads to hope. And the only other intervention I made was the fact that Borges always felt a really strong tension between his desire to read and his love of reading first and foremost, and his sort of sense that he was missing out on life itself through dedicating himself to books. And that's obviously one of the themes of this story as well. When the prophecies emerge, there's a sense of chaos and sort of violence that is unleashed from the idea that people might find the key to their lives through prophecy or whatever. But that obviously then, if they spend their whole life searching for a prophecy that they may or may not find, that's also futile, and they miss out on any other dimension of life that they might have otherwise been able to enjoy.
I think that's a really interesting point. When we first read this story, we might think it's about a library that is the universe and hence is all encompassing, but actually there are these glimmers of some life that's beyond the text, right? The editor is really important. There's an editor who is not in the text, and the fact that it's a different number of symbols, I think, is really important. There is this sense, these little cracks of light that appear, and you realize you don't have to stay in the library, like Borges himself. You don't have to either be on the roof or the basement, pretending to work in your particular municipal library. Every so often something breaks in, and that's a different form of transcendence that may not be the name of God, but it may be a life when you throw your books away and you go out and bloody well live it, right? Which is also maybe a challenge to us as researchers and PhD students or MA students, or even first years. I don't think we have any. I think we're all postgraduate today, but I think that there's that opposition of sort of art and life and the labyrinthine nature of the second, that maybe the fresh air of what's beyond the library, that also is something that occasionally blows in right through the cracks in the walls here. What's outside the library? Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I think we could maybe slowly bring things to a close. Does anyone from any corner of our little virtual world want to come in and make a few final comments, something that's really on their hearts or their minds before we bring things to a close?
I think on my mind is Emily's birthday and the fact that she should be out celebrating that rather than here. So
in the library. Well,
I'm just a nerd. Why would I be anywhere else except here talking about Borges, especially in lockdown?
And even being in a library can be dangerous. You could knock your head on a window and get septicemia. So you should be out. Listen,
Exactly.
thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. And thank you for your fantastic insights into things. I really enjoyed the discussion. Do come along tomorrow to Hélène Neveu's Kringelbach's event. You can get access to the video, the film of the performance, and it's quite magical. It's quite amazing. And then come along and discuss that, Pina Bausch on the beach in Senegal. It will be extraordinary, with, by the way, someone from the dance company and someone from in Germany, and also from the Pina Bausch Foundation, and also the dance company in Senegal. It will be a genuinely international, very interesting discussion about dance and Eurocentrism and African reimagining of European culture and so on. And then on Friday, do come along to Antonis's roundtable about culture in a virtual age, museums in a virtual age. I think, you know, he'll bring in really interesting people. Tim Jordan, who's Professor of Digital Humanities, or I'm not sure quite what his title is, but he's head of BASC. He'll give us another, perhaps, you know, more informed, rather than us art students talking about computers. This will be a really, perhaps, you know, different discussion, but about what culture means in a virtual environment. So thank you to everybody, Safi, Jonathan, and Emily, and my group particularly, but thank you to Natasha, to Jess, who's looked after us so well, to Catherine, of course, to Thompson, who's been behind a lot of this, to Antonis for his curating of this week. Have a great evening. Happy birthday, Emily, and thank you very much. Okay, bye.